Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please welcome Captain Richard Heyman with the talk on Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, Vietnam. Well, almost. We're not quite there. We actually are in Vietnamese waters, and we are feeling the swell of the South China Sea after having left the Gulf of Thailand, and so we finally feel like we're really on a ship if we have to hang on as we go down the hall. We should have fairly easy sailing up the coast of Vietnam, though, because there's no major storm this time of year. And for the mariners in the audience, I brought my chart of the Vietnam coast if you want to come up and look at it later. It's Vietnam's I think many of you have probably been to Vietnam. Some of you lived or worked in Vietnam, and so I have three talks to give about, first of all, Ho Chi Minh City, South Vietnam. One when we go to Da Nang and Hue, where more of the ancient history is, and then we'll go up to Hanoi and northern Vietnam. So I'm going to be kind of skipping around in different topics as I describe some of the aspects of each of these places specifically. But I know some of you actually worked in places, and I look forward to learning stories and ideas and experiences that you've had while you've been here. I myself was too young to be taken off to war, but my father was a U.S. Army career officer, and he was 1963, I believe it was, assigned to be the chief military advisor to the South Vietnamese Military Academy in Da Lat. And as he famously told my brother and I, he said, well, he didn't like the smell of that war, and he refused the assignment, stayed at the Pentagon, and then retired before he ever went to the war, and we ourselves missed it. Later in the 1980s, when I was working with Lindblad Travel, we began to come to Vietnam bringing mostly military and diplomatic or aid workers or some missionaries even who were very experienced in Vietnam, spoke Vietnamese, had worked there much of their life and had the first opportunity to go back. But back then there were no relations between the U.S. and Vietnam, so we always had to go via Thailand, go to the Vietnamese consulate in Bangkok, get our visa, and then fly over into Vietnam. It ended up being a very dramatic return for some of these people, very emotional. They go look up friends that they knew, families they knew. We were very well treated, but we were under the close eye of the Vietnamese government at the time, which at the end of the Cold War was very much aligned with the Russians. And I always remember going to, I was studying music at the time, so I went to the Vietnamese Music Academy where I passed myself off as an East German and spoke my poor German to get in and meet a professor who only spoke French, whereas the younger students all were learning Russian. And this is emblematic of Vietnam has been a country that has been struggling for its independence for many centuries, primarily from the Chinese domination and then colonial era, the French, and then the American era. And now there's a lot of still, there's a reunified country, but it is still not very unified. There's a very big slit between the North and the South to this day. And we, of course, are coming around to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and I'm going to mainly show you this area today, and then we'll have more as we go along up the coast. But you know the map of the country. It has been described as two great deltas, the Red River Delta, then the Mekong Delta, attached by this very narrow central Vietnam spine, which at its narrowest part is only 50 kilometers wide. And the metaphor that the Vietnamese will describe is two baskets full of food that are carried on a stick. So you have the north and the south, the central, but about 90% of the population lives either in the Red River Valley or the Mekong Valley, and the central highlands and the coastal areas are not that populated or developed relatively. Now, we are, of course, coming around to Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, which is still called after these years, and this is the outflow of the great Mekong River. I'm going to show you some of this river because to understand why South Vietnam is the way it is, you have to understand the Mekong River. The river rises in the high plains of Tibet, comes down. Chamdo is actually a town in eastern Tibet, comes down through Yunnan, through the very rough mountains of southwest China, through Laos, Cambodia, and out in Vietnam. Now this river is the largest river in Asia that is still undammed, not industrialized, and has actually very little population base compared to anywhere else of the other large rivers, especially the Yangtze or even the Chao Phraya where we just were. And so this river wanders through rugged territory. It is not navigable, but here's where it looks like in Tibet. The glaciers melt, whatever precipitation comes down through these very rugged mountains that are mostly impassable. At one point there's 3 parallel rivers. The Yangtze, the Mekong, and then the Salaween River are running in tremendous deep, sharp canyons, and it's almost an impassable area to get through. Nowadays there are roads, and then the Chinese are planning to dam the upper Mekong to provide electricity and irrigation for the upper area, but at the expense of the lowland Mekong community, which includes Laos, Thailand, Cambodia. And this is a controversial move by the Chinese to then utilize their part of the river and then minimize the flow that will come down through, especially rapids like this. This is in southern Laos. This is they call it Kole Falls, which for 6 kilometers, there are these very rough falls. You see the size of the fishermen there. When the French first came up, they thought that this would be a route to go to trade with China, but they came up that far and no ship could pass and there's no way to clear that much of the rapids. They have a catfish in this part of the river which grows to be 3 meters long, 9 feet, weighs over 650 pounds, and this is what these guys are spearing for. Well, now there's a proposal among the Laotian government with the aid of the World Bank to dam these rapids and provide navigation up through here. But it is, of course, at the expense of the greater watershed. Now, the Mekong comes down through the mountains. It hits the flat plains. It is suddenly a broad and slower river. This is in Laos, where you see it has somewhat of a Thai-style pagodas. I think that's, who is that on that spire? It must be the goddess of mercy. And then the river comes through, getting more population. It flattens out, leaves the mountains, and comes down into the central Cambodian plains. Now, some of you went to Angkor Wat and Siem Reap the other day, which is, you have the first-hand experience of going over this vast waterway that is one of the largest freshwater lakes in Asia, but it has a fantastic ability to grow and shrink with the monsoon seasons. That starts in May, June, fills up, and by the winter and the dry season where we are now, it has flowed down out, and there's a lot of fertile land left in the floodplains of the Tunnel Sap. Now, this is not in Vietnam, but it is just up the river from Saigon, being the major city of the Mekong. So you have people that are very much water-based in their agriculture and their lifestyle. Here's an example of floating houses and then also stilt houses, where in the dry season they're like this, but come the rainy season they need a boat to get around. So yeah, this is not unlike many river deltas, but this is just right up from Saigon, and so the difference between Cambodia down to the lower Mekong is not that great. Now, the Vietnamese will call the upper area the upper river, or the Thien Giang, and then their part is the Hao Giang, which is where the delta spreads out. You have still a lot of commerce coming up and down the river, especially from the remnant forests that are up in Cambodia. Much of the South Vietnam forests have already been cut and agriculturalized for the very large population. But you have trade with the great production of rice. About half of the rice of Vietnam is produced in the lower delta. About 1 in 5 people live within the delta. This great delta is actually about 15,000 square miles with over 2,000 kilometers of water lanes. And here's the different provinces. Saigon is, of course, right up in the center of that, but we're now probably about here. We're going to come around the great Cape Cao Ma, it's called, to this part of Vietnam. Now, you can see that Saigon is actually up the river and inland, and it's a bit uphill, let's say, from the actual delta itself. Some people may take that tour out into the Mekong, which is a full-day trip out to My Tho is the town. You usually go there, and then you go off into riverboats, and then you're in this great maze of waterways. This is the actual delta seen from space, and there's 7 major tributaries to the delta, but the Vietnamese in their superstition think that's not a lucky number, so they call it the 9 dragons of the Mekong come out into the sea, and you can you can see how much mud comes out in the rainy season. You may see the sea color change quite dramatically as we come around this, the Samoa Peninsula and see the outflow from this great river system. Here's more of a close-up of it. And we will sail up not the Mekong itself, but the Saigon River, which is a smaller river that's just to the northeast of this. The life in this part of the world is, let's say, very soggy. People get around in boats. Their houses are on stilts. They have this great flood and dry season, which predicts their agricultural cycle. They grow a lot of fruit, vegetables, rice. They've built up paddies and irrigated areas. Much of it was unfortunately deforested and destroyed during the Vietnam War, because to chase the Viet Cong in the Mekong Delta meant that many areas were sprayed with Agent Orange, and there's some permanent damage, not just to the flora and fauna, but to a lot of the people that have grown up with birth defects and other problems because of that era. Now it's growing back up, and it's a fairly prosperous part of Vietnam. Here's a water taxi, which you'll have to wear your wet shoes to go on. But it's a very labyrinthine area with a lot of people living in the jungle, essentially. It's very thick, a lot of it, and the life is, let's say, close to nature. So one of the features that they've had there, recent research have found some unique species of reptiles. Here's a leaf frog that will look like a piece of a leaf in the woods, and here's another one called the moss frog, which if you look on the ground, you won't see it at all. It looks like a piece of moth until it winks its eye at you. And in this area, there's a lot of snakes and other small wild cats and a lot of birds and things. But most famously, this is where in Vietnam they make snake liquor. So here's a woman selling the snakes, and then this is what is done with it. Now this is a tonic that is not served at the bar here until we pick up a couple of bottles tomorrow. But it's meant... and it is not meant for the women. This is only for the men. I don't know why. There's something in it that is for men only. And this is part of the traditional Asian belief in the yin and the yang, and there are the complementing forces of the male, female, light, dark, strong, weak, which is very much the ethos of Vietnam as it is through China, the rest of East Asia. After you have a shot of that, you really know what yang feels like, I suppose. But anyway, here's just a view of what is outside Saigon. This is just the countryside that has now come into Saigon in a tremendous way. Saigon used to be a small trading city. Now it's a vast metropolis of about 4 million people. Ever since the French came, there have been a lot of roads and bridges and things meant that a lot of the isolation of the countryside has now been diminished, and people can come and trade in the city. And it's a very populated and fairly agriculturally well-developed, though it's not that industrialized in the delta itself because of the nature of the ground. There's not that much building done there. But this is the kind of life. People live by agriculture, fishing, and planting rice. This is the key crop, of course, of Asia, but especially the Mekong Delta can get 3 crops a year. And this is the hard labor usually done by the women. You can see them out there planting, and then when they drain the paddy field, the grain will dry out. They will then thresh it and then take it to market. Here's one of the houses where they're packaging it, and then they'll send it on rice barges or carry it on truck to the city. Oh, here's a view of a family who has a house with a catfish farm under their floorboards, and they're feeding kind of a gruel made from rice husks to the fish who are getting their daily meal. And then I guess they cover that over and sit and fatten up the fish before they fish in their own living room, take it to market. So this is the life of the Delta here. The women do an inordinate amount of work. Now, I'm sure you ladies can appreciate this, how much hard labor your husbands have put you through to all the years. But it's a very big contrast in Vietnamese society, what the men will do and what the women will do. And this has been, again, related to the yin and the yang and the kind of overbearing patriarchy versus the more subtle and nurturing female side. And in Vietnamese, they actually separate the human qualities by this. So for the women, they are supposed to live up to propriety, which is called le, tin, sincerity, tin, which is spontaneity, and then nan, which is feeling. And then the men are supposed to have, above all, li, which is reason and judgment, hin, which is filial piety, to make sure the children are behave, and then they worship their ancestors, and especially the elders. And then on, the moral debt between people is considered a male quality that is enforced through the family. Then there's another one called de, which is brother relationships, the proper relationship between men to keep the family intact and to be productive. And then trong, or loyalty, and then nya, which is righteousness. And then last, tri, which is learning. And so in traditional Vietnamese society, these sort of Confucian values are very important in the family. But naturally, it seems like the women do more of the work, and they tend to do especially the commerce and the marketing. So you can see when we go to the markets, it's mostly women doing the business. If they come, all these goods come out of the Mekong Valley, they will come to major trading centers, and they will deliver their goods. Here's a morning rush hour in the Delta. And then they come to market towns. Often they're built out over the water. Here is a town called Phong Hiep, which is right in the center of the Delta, which is at the confluence of a number of these channels, all natural, they're not dug. And then you can imagine what the hubbub of this town is like. This is maybe what Saigon looked like about 300 years ago. But out in the Delta, these towns are very important economically. Then they'll come into Saigon with the larger loads, and the things, of course, get mechanized, and there are a lot of roads and freeways, but there's still a lot of life on the river. This is right in south side of Saigon, where some of the markets are. When you go out on the tours, city tours, you'll see scenes like this. They're bringing in the ducks from the countryside on one of the new paved roads. See, the women have to paddle, the guys get to drive the motorcycles, it seems, mostly. Here's lunch coming to meet us. And then meanwhile, some are just sitting around reading the paper. Now, I put this picture up because the Vietnamese are famously literary and read quite a bit, and there are many writers and poets. And this is another of the qualities that men are supposed to develop, their literary mind, their poetic mind, whereas women are often left to the home and the children. And men take a position, but it's often the women who have more influence. It's said the man is at the front door of the house and the women at the back door. If you really want to know what's going on and get something done, you go to the back door, talk to the women. And even though the men have a sort of an overbearing attitude often, they are ineffective without the proper relations with women. Now, we don't know much about this in our society. At least I have to call my wife to find out. But there's an old story, which is not Vietnamese, actually Chinese, about this Confucian family structure where the men are supposedly in charge. And the rice farmer is out drinking with his buddies, and he comes home, and the wife is upset because he didn't get any work done, and he's a little tipsy, and she starts to berate him. She picks up a spoon and starts to hit him over the head, and he jumps under the bed. And the wife says, "You no good for nothing husband, you come out and get the thrashing you deserve." And the man under the bed said, "Woman, I'm the man of the house, and I will not come out from under the bed. I'm in charge." Anyway, so this is, you can see as we're in South Vietnam, southern Vietnam, I should say, that it's a very active, commercial, economically prosperous area. Saigon is the biggest city, the biggest markets, the highest per capita income, and a lot of it's based on the work in the countryside, and then the markets in the city, and now you'll see Saigon as a big modern metropolis. But the role between men and women is sort of stark on the streets, and you'll see a lot of men sitting around being poets, and the women doing much of the work. Now, I have an image here of a Cao Dai priest. And this is very much a reflection of ancient Vietnamese culture. This robe is typically called a Confucian robe, where the men study, and this man is an elder priest in this Vietnamese religion, which believes in the sacred eye. And this is an example of how, even after wars and a century or two of modernization, some of the traditional culture still survives. And I'm going to read when the French came, and then the world came, and some of the traditionalists did not like it, and so a poet back named Nguyen Dick Cho in 1888 wrote, "The way of heaven is not all remote. You wash a human heart, and out it comes. And how can a man of righteousness betray his country? How can a man of righteousness reject his family